Most of us have a little voice in our heads that tells us what to do. I don't mean that literally, more metaphorically. Thoughts, feelings, intuition, call it what you will. I hate to get too Jiminy Cricket on you, but we have to let our conscience be our guide. Except, what if, just supposing for a moment, that the little voice in your head doesn't belong to you? Those whispers and nudges from your brain, what if they aren't from your brain? What if they come from somewhere else? From someone else? An entity, a god, or a devil? Or maybe it's just mental illness rearing its ugly head. Except, how can you tell? Where does conscience end and mental illness begin? Is there even a difference? Other than perhaps what that little voice tells you to do? And don't bother turning to books or science for the answer. It can't tell you. Secrets of the brain, particularly of the sleeping mind, are a mystery to us all. The following is a true story about the nature of evil, how it lives inside us, and how it spreads. This is 37 Deathbed Confessions. Drinking whiskey in the kitchen and telling scary stories around the fire. Music, monsters, and mayhem. Killers, cannibals, and cults. Fearful fiction and furious fact. Tall tales and terrifying truths. This is a scary home companion. Minoru Muto was, above all else, an easygoing dude. For a man who lived with death almost every single day, Minoru never seemed to let it get him down. He had chosen this path in particular based on where he felt he could do the most good in the world. It was a long, twisted, and oftentimes depressing path, which had led him to hospice care, and eventually here, to the Granger House Hospice, where he had been working for almost 2 years. Hospice care has a high turnover rate. It takes a lot out of a person, which is precisely why Minoru ended up there. Once upon a time, he was the U.S.-born son of 2 immigrants from Japan. From a young age, Minoru knew he wanted to work in the medical field. He joined the Army right out of high school and spent a 4-year hitch in a military hospital. In 2001, he left as a registered nurse and took a job as a paramedic in his old hometown in eastern Ohio. The following year, Minoru was one of the 3rd wave of responders to a scene of catastrophic violence at a remote locale called Bob Wire's Barbed Wire Emporium. The world came to know it as the day of the trapdoor spider. But to Minoru, it was the day he walked away from being a paramedic forever. The up-close and personal trauma and death shocked him to the core. It was far worse than anything he had experienced in the Army. He just wasn't built for being in the middle of the action. It turned out to be a blessing in disguise, because it was that very day, that horrific event, that pushed him towards his true calling. Minoru and his partner were tending to a man who had been eviscerated with razor wire. There were still scraps of it wrapped around an exposed piece of his spine. The man was incoherent, in blinding pain, and dying. While his partner administered painkillers to the man, Minoru sat with him, holding his hands, looking him in the face, and speaking to him very gently. He watched the man die. His eyes didn't flutter or close. They stayed wide open. So Minoru literally saw the life drain from behind them. That moment made a huge impression on Minoru. Being there for someone in their dying moments, calming them, hearing them, being with them, that was what he could offer the world. He could give people a final moment that they deserved, which led him into home care, and then hospice care, and then to the Granger house, where he felt very much at home. Despite the grim nature of his work, tending to people in the last days of their lives, Minoru always managed to retain a laid-back attitude and a sunny disposition. Remember when I said Minoru was easygoing? He was so easygoing that he actually went by Mike at work. He always had. He was Mike Muto, just because it was easier. Most of his patients were old, infirm, in pain, nearing the end, so why give them something hard to pronounce? Not to mention the racism and anti-Asian sentiment that still ran pretty high in some of the old-timers. What was the point of starting an issue with them? So yeah, let's just say Mike. Mike's good. Mike's easy. After all, the hospice wasn't a place to make a moral stand. Minoru was here to help these people as best he could. He tended them, he sat with them. More than anything else, he listened to them. He helped them find some kind of closure. Sitting next to so many deathbeds, he heard a lot of secrets get spilled. Those horrible little skeletons in the closet that people wanted to unburden before they crossed over. Even as easygoing as Minoru was, it was stressful work. So in his off hours, he surrounded himself with life. He played racquetball 4 times a week. He was part of 2 separate fantasy football leagues. And not because he actually liked football, he sort of preferred the math part of it. But it was really about interacting with friends. He kept a very active social life and tried his best to live healthy. But the real focus of his life was his work and his patients. Patients like Eleanor Papadimitriou. Back in her day, Eleanor had been a nurse focusing on end-of-life care, and now she was the recipient of her own profession. Eleanor liked Minoru enough to remember his real name. She'd been there for 2 weeks, and over that time, Minoru had come to enjoy his daily talks with her. Eleanor could relate to him in a way that few others could. One day, quite out of the blue, Eleanor raised the topic of Deathbed Confessions. It seemed that the frail old lady had one of her own to make. At her request, Minoru told Eleanor about the first deathbed confession he had taken. At that point, he had been around death many, many times. But this was the first time someone had confessed to him and asked for forgiveness. The man was a Vietnam veteran. He carried the burden of his actions for decades. Racked with dementia and pain, he believed that Minoru was the Vietnamese soldier he had killed all those years ago. He begged to be absolved. Minoru held the man's hands and said, "I forgive you. We all forgive you." Minutes later, the man was dead. Did it help? Eleanor asked. Minoru said that he'd like to think that it did. And she agreed. It's good to get things out. Release them before it's too late. Some things stay behind. Minoru asked Eleanor about her experiences. She had served in a military hospital in New York City during the final weeks of World War II. She was there for the wounded and maimed soldiers as they came home, even when they had no home to return to. She dealt with many desperate souls, saved a few, lost a few, and heard a lot of horror stories along the way. Over the subsequent years, after the military hospital on through her time in the private sector, Eleanor said that in total she had heard 37 deathbed confessions. She remembered each with perfect clarity, particularly the last. Minoru was currently at 6. Eleanor mumbled something about lucky number 7, but then she felt tired and needed a nap. Minoru updated her chart and took a few moments to dust her shelves. Eleanor kept a small set of wooden shelves filled with knickknacks, framed photos, and an antique glass jar. He always liked looking through the old snapshots of his patients. It made him feel more connected to them. When he returned the next day, Eleanor was waiting for him. "Do you believe that evil is real?" she asked him flatly. Minoru looked at her chart. Her decline had been so severe and so continuous, he could hardly believe that she was still alive. "Mike?" She corrected herself. "I mean, Minoru. Did you hear me? I'm talking to you. Don't look at the chart, look at me. I'm not dead yet. I'm Eleanor Papademetrio. Pleased to meet you." Minoru chuckled and shook her wilted, limp hand with a stilted formality. "I'm so sorry, Eleanor. What were you asking me?" "Do you think evil is real?" "Of course." "Not in an abstract way. I mean, a real, physical, evil presence in the world." "You mean like the old-timey devil with a pitchfork and a bifurcated tail?" She said, "Meh," but she said it in a way that didn't use the word but her whole body. Meh. "I believe that evil is real, Minoru. It can control us in ways we never knew existed." He sat next to her on the bed. "Eleanor, I don't think I follow you, hon. What are you telling me?" She sighed and moved away from him. Eleanor was so frail and slight that him sitting on the bed made her slide towards his indentation. "The first deathbed confession I heard that got to me was number 5. The man had lost his legs in the war. He told me about a woman in France he had found alone. He had his way with her, and when he finished, she took his gun and shot herself in the head. Minoru, I've never seen a man so filled with remorse. But each one was different in their own way. Usually they're tragic accidents or things that happen under unthinkable circumstances. A heat of passion, a bar fight, a hitchhiker on the side of the road that you didn't see, a fellow climber abandoned so that you could conserve supplies. All of them horrible actions, but not as horrible as others. Like number 19. He built a bomb out of car batteries to kill the man who stole his wife. Turns out his wife also died in the blast. And the police never came to arrest him. He wanted them to. He felt terrible. But they never came, so he made more bombs. He wanted to be caught, but he just couldn't bring himself to go to the police. So he killed 4 more people till they caught him. But you know what? He only felt guilty about his wife. Isn't that curious? Minoru heard a quiet alarm sound from down the hall. He patted Eleanor's hand. Eleanor, I need to... No, wait! I need to tell you about number 37, the one that made me leave nursing. The one that made me leave my family. Minoru got to his feet. Someone was coding, and he couldn't be absent when he was needed the most. Eleanor, sweetheart, I want to hear you, but I'm needed right now. I'll be back tomorrow, okay? She clutched his wrist. Not tomorrow. Tonight. It has to be tonight. I can feel it. He assured her, and then he went down the hall to find out who was leaving the hospice. Eleanor's eyes struggled to open. You came back. In truth, Minoru had returned minutes after their previous discussion, only to find her asleep. So he went home for a shower and a quick bowl of grape nuts, and then came back. He'd just been sitting with her for a few minutes when she awoke. She smiled at him placidly, happy to see him, and he realized that she didn't remember what she was going to tell him. Eleanor, you asked me to come back. You wanted to tell me about the final confession you heard as a nurse. Remember? She slowly nodded and then wagged her finger at him. Of course I remember. It wanted me to forget. Thanks to the Alzheimer's, I forget what it wants me to forget. Now it was Minoru's turn to stare blankly. He was totally lost. The last confession I heard was from a man named John Peabody. Such an ordinary name, but I can never forget it. John told me the most horrible things I've ever heard. Even with all the death and misery, I thought I'd heard it all, but I was wrong. John Peabody caused me to turn my head. It was the first time I ever done that, I turned away so that he couldn't see how sickened I was for his victims. The most curious part of it was the voice in his head. John told me about the voice, one that only he could hear, that told him what to do. It was just a whisper, really. It was quiet at first, but he said how it got louder over time. It told him things, and it told him how to do things. It gave him orders. When he followed the orders, he felt good, and his dreams were of paradise eternal. When he didn't obey, he suffered. Depression, anxiety, migraines, waking up covered in cuts and bruises, so he gave in. And he said that before long he grew to enjoy doing what the voice told him. But on his deathbed it was different. His mind was falling apart, and this gave him a moment of clarity, free from the voice, finally mentally away from it, but too physically weak to do anything. John asked that I sit with him that night. He knew it was his last night, and he didn't want to be alone when he passed. I sat in my chair next to the bed, and I read for a while. The next thing I knew, the sun was coming up, and I was leaning against the head of the bed. John had died over the night. He seemed to have died peacefully, other than a little blood around his eye socket. Eleanor paused to take a deep breath. The next night, I heard the voice in my head. Don't tell her. I was sitting on my porch watching my kids play in the yard, and the voice told me how nice it would feel if they were quiet forever. Just like John said, it started small, very faint in the back of my head, but it was always there. And the headaches, bad ones, nosebleeds too, and then I killed one of my cats. I did it. I chose to do it because the voice said so. And then the headache went away. I had the most wonderful dreams, Minoru. It felt so right. When I woke up the next morning, the rest of my cats were dead. I don't remember doing it, but I know that I did it. When I was sleeping, the voice did it with my hands. So immediately, I packed up my things and I left. My husband Charles, my 3 children, my sisters, my job, my whole life, everything. I just cleared out the bank account and I ran. I ran because I was afraid of what the voice might make me do to them. Killing my first was easier than I expected. The second one was even easier. I hated what I was doing, Minoru, I promise you. I hated it. But I felt powerless. Somehow, that man, John Peabody, his evil had infected me. It had spread to me. That voice had gotten inside my thoughts and dreams, and it was stronger than I was. So I learned to give up. I never learned to enjoy it, but I learned to hate it less. One last time. It really wasn't his fault. John Peabody didn't want to do those things any more than I did. But we both did them. It was a little piece of the devil. I can still feel it crawling around inside sometimes. Minoru was standing next to her, looking down. How many? He asked. How many what, dear? How many people have you killed, Eleanor? Oh, let's see. People, not animals? 84, including the babies. Minoru wavered on his feet, trying to wrap his head around that number. It couldn't possibly be true. Could it? She was just a demented, sick old woman. He got close to her again, but not as close. Just out of reach, just in case. Tell me about them, Eleanor. She coughed and looked away. There's no time for all of that. Too many. I didn't ask you here to confess. My sins are my sins. I learned that my sins might not cross over with me. They may stay here. So I asked you here for a favor, not a confession. Stay with me tonight. Please. But I beg you, don't fall asleep. Sit with me. Make sure that as soon as it happens, you send me to get cremated. Immediately. You bitch. Minoru, there's an evil inside me, and I need you to make sure it dies with me. Please, indulge a wicked old woman. Minoru moved his chair to the corner and sat next to the shelves. He watched her. She fell asleep quickly, tired from her monologue. And before long, he found himself drifting as well. He studied all the pictures and Hummel figurines on the shelf. A large antique glass jar seemed to dominate it. Minoru recognized it, of course, having seen a similar jar in most of the other rooms of the hospice. Shockingly, looking at glass jars and Hummel figurines wasn't enough to keep him fully awake. He didn't go to sleep entirely, but was sort of in and out, until Eleanor grunted. She gasped deeply, rolled onto her side, and exhaled one last breath. Minoru didn't move. In accordance with her wishes, he watched her closely. He'd done crazier things to honor the dying request of a loony bird. But there was no mystery or magic, no demons or devils. Just a dead-ass, crazy old woman who may or may not have killed a lot of people. It was hard to say, but holy shit. In the pale moonlight, Minoru saw Eleanor's eyelid twitch. It bulged outward before the corner pushed open, and a long black slug oozed from her socket, sliding out from beside the eyeball, glittering dirty emerald green in the gloom. Minoru held his breath and stared at it crawling. Eleanor wasn't loony after all. And she was right about one thing, at least. We all have a little voice in our heads. It isn't usually a sentient tumor. More often than not, it's our instincts. Minoru listened to those instincts. He didn't think. He didn't give himself the chance to freak out, although he was real fucking close to freaking out. He just snatched that heavy glass jar off the knick-knack shelf, flipped it open, and slammed it down on Eleanor's face. He was a little too forceful, cracking her cheek and orbital bones like saltines. But it worked. Minoru pulled the jar away from her and slapped the lid shut. It was lined with a rubber stopper and had a brass clasp to seal it shut. Once he had it sitting back on the knick-knack shelf, Minoru allowed himself to hyperventilate a little bit, just as a treat. An appetizer for the full-on meltdown that was awaiting him when he got back home. What the absolute goddamn hell was that shit? The entire episode had elapsed in mere seconds, and now he was trembling, palms on knees, staring at a thick glass jar with a mind slug crawling around the sides of it. He took long, deep, calming breaths, and then said, out loud, so that he could gauge the sound of it, "A living thing just came out of Eleanor's head, and that is something that really happened. You caught it in a jar. You didn't touch it. It's under control. It doesn't make sense, but it's under control. Chill, Minoru. Chill." The door opened, and a nurse entered. Lucrezia was working tonight, and she was quite surprised to see Minoru in the room with a dead Eleanor Papademetrio. Minoru looked at his coworker and raised his hands, like, I don't even know where to begin, but without the words, because he didn't have any. Lucrezia checked on Eleanor and grimaced at the state of her face. Then she looked over and saw the jar. "Oh," she said, realization creeping in. "Yeah, it's fucked up, right?" "What?" he asked her. "It's been a while, but I've seen one before. It's crazy shit, man." Lucrezia covered up Eleanor with a sheet and made the appropriate notes on her chart. "I know it's a lot to wrap your head around. I suggest you don't think about it. You are going to see a lot of crazy things in hospice, Mike. You got to learn to let that shit go." He nodded. "Okay, so what do we do with this?" Lucrezia picked up the jar and looked at it. She wrinkled her nose. It was repellent. Then she tossed it to Minoru. "Just call the number, man." He called the jar and then turned it over in his hands. Etched into the bottom was a phone number. "This just keeps getting weirder," he said. But in reality, he had no idea how weird it could get. Thank you for listening to another episode of A Scary Home Companion. Reach the show on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Or email us directly at ascaryhomecompanion@gmail.com. Support the show on Patreon. A few bucks a month, you get a ton of extras and a new exclusive bonus episode each and every month just for patrons. So if you like the show and you want the full story, you need to join. The latest exclusive episode is Whatever Happened to Dr. Catharsis. It's a deep dive into a pivotal but very overlooked character. The show was produced and edited by Jeff Davidson, featuring a guest voice from Dr. Rebecca Haviland as the Brain Slug. It featured the music Let the Night Fall by Marrach, Become Death by Jahzzar, Edge of a Squall by Uncle Woody Sullender and Seamus Cater, Silent Voice by Darkstar83, Soul Window by Strange Voices, and Chelsea Oxendine with the theme music. His This fucking bird. I hope we're not picking up this bird because this bird's fucking goddamn pissing me off. I've said it before, Jeff. I fucking said it before. I hate birds. If I could press a button and bird poison would release, sorry about your damn bird, dude. Buddy's gotta go, you know? I know there are a few good ones. But I think they all gotta go for the good of the planet. And fucking my sanity. All right. Hate birds.